15-year-old Jamie lived with his mother in a small, weathered house at the edge of Maple Grove, a neighborhood where time seemed to move a little slower and the days felt a little longer. The sidewalks were cracked, and the picket fences that lined the streets leaned precariously, as if bowing to the weight of years gone by. Life here wasn't easy, and for Jamie and his mom, it often felt like an uphill climb. His mom worked double shifts at the diner downtown to make ends meet, but even with her long hours, there was never quite enough money to go around. Jamie's sneakers were patched with duct tape, and he wore the same few shirts to school on rotation, but he tried not to complain. He knew his mom was doing the best she could. Despite their struggles, Jamie carried a sense of optimism that made him stand out. He wasn't the type to feel sorry for himself. Instead, he poured his energy into small joys basketball, doodling on his school notebooks, and exploring the world around him. One crisp October afternoon, Jamie was out in front of his house, practicing basketball. The ball was worn and scuffed from years of use, but it was still his favorite escape. He tossed it toward the side of his garage, aiming for an imaginary hoop painted in his mind. The ball hit the wall, rebounded awkwardly, and began to roll down the street. "Great," Jamie muttered, jogging after it. The ball picked up speed, bouncing unpredictably, until it veered into the yard next door. Jamie stopped at the edge of the overgrown lawn, eyeing the house. It belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Gables, the neighborhood's mysterious elderly widow. The house had seen better days. Its once bright white paint was chipped and peeling, and the shutters hung at odd angles. The yard was a tangle of weeds, and a rusted birdbath sat empty by the porch. Mrs. Gables rarely came outside, and when she did, it was usually to collect her mail or sit quietly on her porch with a book. She didn't speak much to anyone, and the kids in the neighborhood whispered stories about her. Some claimed she was a witch who brewed potions inside her old house. Others said she had a treasure hidden in the basement. Jamie didn't believe any of it. To him, Mrs. Gables seemed lonely. She reminded him of his grandma, who had passed away the year before. He hesitated briefly, then pushed open the creaky gate and stepped into her yard. The basketball had rolled to a stop near a cluster of overgrown bushes. Jamie reached for it, but before he could pick it up, he heard the unmistakable creak of the front door opening. "Who's there?" a voice called out, sharp and wary. Jamie froze. Slowly, he turned toward the house. Standing in the doorway was Mrs. Gables herself, peering out at him with a look that was equal parts suspicion and curiosity. Her gray hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore a faded cardigan that looked as old as the house. "Sorry, Ma," Jamie said, holding up his hands as if to show he meant no harm. "My basketball rolled into your yard. I was just grabbing it." Mrs. Gables squinted at him, her piercing blue eyes scanning his face. For a moment, she didn't say anything, and Jamie wondered if she was about to tell him off. Finally, she nodded. "Go ahead," she said, stepping back slightly but keeping the door open just a crack. Jamie bent down to pick up the ball, but as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A clay pot near the steps had tipped over, spilling dirt and the delicate roots of a wilting flower onto the cracked walkway. Without thinking, Jamie set the basketball aside and crouched down to fix it. He gently scooped the soil back into the pot, pressing it down with his fingers, and stood the flower upright again. When he glanced back toward the house, he noticed Mrs. Gables watching him. Her expression had softened, and for a moment, Jamie thought he saw a flicker of something like gratitude in her eyes. "You don't see many young people caring about flowers these days," she said, her voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. Jamie shrugged, brushing the dirt off his hands. "It just seemed like it needed fixing," he said. "Sorry if I was in the way." Mrs. Gables shook her head. Not at all. She hesitated, as if weighing her next words carefully. Then she surprised him by asking, "Do you like tea?" Jamie blinked. He hadn't expected the question. Sure," he said, unsure of what else to say. "Come inside," she said, opening the door wider. Jamie glanced back toward his own house. His mom wouldn't be home for a few hours, and he didn't have anything pressing to do. Besides, Mrs. Gables looked like she could use the company. He tucked the basketball under his arm and followed her inside. The house was exactly what Jamie expected, old-fashioned and a little cluttered, but cozy in its own way. The scent of lavender and something faintly sweet hung in the air. Mrs. Gables led him to the kitchen, where she set about boiling water and pulling mismatched cups from the cupboard. As they sat down at the small wooden table, Jamie noticed a photo on the wall, a younger Mrs. Gables standing next to a man who must have been her husband. There was something tender in the way they looked at each other, and Jamie realized how empty the house must feel without him. They talked for a while, their conversation meandering from Jamie's love of basketball to Mrs. Gables's fond memories of the garden she used to keep when she was younger. She told him about the roses she had planted and how much her late husband had loved tending to the birdbath outside. Before he knew it, an hour had passed. Jamie stood to leave, thanking her for the tea. As he reached the door, Mrs. Gables said, "You can come back if you'd like. I don't get many visitors." Jamie smiled. "I'd like that." That day marked the beginning of a friendship neither of them had expected. The next week, Jamie found himself knocking on Mrs. Gables's door again. At first, he told himself it was because he didn't have much else to do after school, but deep down, he enjoyed the time he spent with her. There was something about her quiet but sharp demeanor that made him feel like he was stepping into a different world, one far removed from his usual routine of homework, basketball, and worrying about money. When Mrs. Gables opened the door, she didn't seem surprised to see him. "I thought you might come back," she said with the faintest smile. This time, Jamie brought over an old jigsaw puzzle he'd found in a box in their attic. The pieces were faded, and the image on the box of a sunny cottage surrounded by flowers was barely legible, but it was something he thought they could do together. Mrs. Gables raised an eyebrow when he showed her. "It's been years since I've done one of these," she said, but her tone carried a note of curiosity. They sat at her dining table, sorting the pieces into edges and middles. Jamie noticed how her hands, though thin and a little shaky, moved with a precision that hinted at a careful, deliberate nature. As they worked, she told him stories about her late husband, Arthur, who had loved puzzles and had an almost uncanny knack for finding the hardest pieces first. Arthur was the patient one, she said, holding up a sky-blue piece and squinting at it. He'd sit for hours with these, not stopping until it was finished. Me? I'd get frustrated halfway through. Jamie chuckled. "I don't know if I have the patience for this either, but it's nice to have something to do." As the days turned into weeks, Jamie began visiting Mrs. Gables more often. It became a sort of routine. He'd finish his homework, drop by her house, and they'd spend the afternoon talking, playing board games, or working on small projects. Once, he helped her clean out her garage, unearthing old photo albums and knickknacks she hadn't seen in years. Another time, they baked cookies together, a recipe she swore by from her younger days. For Mrs. Gables, Jamie's visits brought life back into her days. She had always been a solitary person, especially after Arthur's passing, but Jamie's presence filled the quiet with laughter and conversation. She found herself looking forward to his knock on the door, and in a way it made her feel younger. For Jamie, the friendship was a welcome escape from the pressures of his life. Mrs. Gables listened in a way that made him feel truly seen, and she had a knack for offering advice without sounding preachy. Once, when he complained about struggling with math, she told him, "Every problem has a solution. You just have to look at it from the right angle." Jamie laughed. "That sounds like something a math teacher would say." "Maybe," she replied, "but it's true for more than just numbers." Though Jamie enjoyed their time together, he noticed little details about her life that made him wonder. The house was full of old things, but it lacked the warmth of someone who had frequent visitors. She rarely talked about family, and when she did, it was in passing mentions of distant relatives she hadn't seen in years. It struck Jamie that he might be one of the few people she spoke to regularly. One chilly afternoon, as they sat on her porch drinking tea, Jamie finally asked, "Do you have any family nearby?" Mrs. Gables was quiet for a moment. her gaze drifting to the empty birdbath in the yard. Not really, she said. I had a brother, but he passed years ago. Arthur and I never had children. There are some nieces and nephews, but they have their own lives. I don't hear from them much. Jamie felt a pang of sadness for her. It must get lonely, he said, then immediately worried he'd overstepped. Mrs. Gables gave him a small smile. It did for a long time. But not so much anymore. She looked at him with a kindness that made him feel unexpectedly proud, as though he'd done something good without realizing it. As winter approached, Jamie's visits became even more regular. His mom had picked up extra shifts at the diner, and their already tight finances grew even more strained. He didn't want to burden his mom with his worries, so he found solace in Mrs. Gables' company. She always seemed to know when he was holding something back. One evening, after noticing Jamie picking at his food during dinner, she said, "You seem distracted, Jamie. What's on your mind?" Jamie hesitated. He wasn't sure if it was right to share his family's struggles, but something about Mrs. Gables made him feel like he could. "It's just things at home have been tough," he admitted. "My mom works so hard, but it feels like it's never enough. I just wish I could do more to help." Mrs. Gables nodded thoughtfully, her eyes soft with understanding. "You're a good boy, Jamie. Your mother is lucky to have you. And don't underestimate the value of being there for her. Sometimes that's more important than anything money can buy." Jamie took her words to heart. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something more. He started looking for odd jobs around the neighborhood, shoveling snow or raking leaves for neighbors, hoping to ease the burden on his mom. Mrs. Gables, ever observant, noticed his efforts. One day she handed him an envelope. "For the work you did in my garage," she said simply. Jamie opened it and saw a $20 bill inside. He started to protest, but she waved him off. "You earned it, Jamie. And besides, it makes me happy to see you trying so hard." Though he accepted the money, Jamie was more moved by the gesture itself. It wasn't just the money, it was the sense that someone believed in him, saw his effort, and wanted to help. As the snow began to fall and the holiday season approached, Jamie and Mrs. Gables grew closer than ever. They decorated a small Christmas tree together in her living room, using ornaments she had collected over decades. For Jamie, it felt like a second home, a place where he could forget about his worries and simply enjoy the company of someone who truly cared. Winter melted into spring, and Jamie's visits to Mrs. Gables' house became a constant in his life. The once strange house now felt like a second home, with its creaky floors and shelves filled with dusty books. Mrs. Gables, once guarded and reserved, seemed to thrive in Jamie's company. Her laughter became more frequent, and she began sharing more stories about her life, her travels with her late husband, the time she accidentally set the kitchen curtains on fire while learning to bake, and the little traditions they had for every season. For Jamie, these afternoons became an anchor. The time he spent at her house offered a kind of warmth and stability that he hadn't realized he needed. At home, things were still tough. His mom was exhausted from work, and Jamie had taken on even more odd jobs to help out. Mrs. Gables' house was the one place where he could let his guard down and just be himself. One sunny afternoon in late April, Mrs. Gables surprised Jamie by leading him into a room he'd never seen before. The room was small but filled with vibrant life. Potted plants lined the windowsills, their green leaves soaking up the sunlight. On a wooden table in the center of the room sat a sewing machine and stacks of colorful fabric. "I used to sew all the time," Mrs. Gables said, running her hand over the machine. "Clothes, curtains, even quilts. Haven't done much of it in years, though." Jamie raised an eyebrow. "Why not? This room's amazing." She smiled wistfully. "It's hard to feel inspired when there's no one to sew for." Jamie tilted his head, an idea forming in his mind. "What if you made something for me? Like, I don't know, a patch for my jacket. It's got this rip I've been meaning to fix." Mrs. Gables chuckled. "A patch. That's easy. But if I'm going to sew again, it might as well be something bigger." Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Gables took to sewing like she'd never stopped. She worked on a quilt, piecing together squares of fabric in a rainbow of colors. Jamie helped where he could, cutting fabric or holding pins, though he wasn't exactly skilled at it. As they worked, Jamie noticed a new light in her eyes. She seemed happier, more energetic. "You know," she said one day, "I think Arthur would have liked you. He always said we should have had a son. You remind me of him in some ways." Jamie didn't know what to say, so he just nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. But as spring gave way to summer, Jamie began to notice subtle changes in Mrs. Gables. She moved a little slower, her hands trembling slightly when she held a cup of tea. She waved it off when Jamie asked about it, saying, "Old age has a way of sneaking up on you." Still, Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One June morning, Jamie knocked on her door like he always did, but there was no answer. He waited a few minutes, then tried again, his stomach twisting with worry. Finally, he peeked through the window and saw her sitting in her armchair, her head resting against the back. "Mrs. Gables," he called, his voice cracking. She didn't respond. Heart pounding, Jamie ran home and told his mom, who immediately called for help. The paramedics arrived quickly, but there was little they could do. Mrs. Gables had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Jamie stood on the porch, his hands shaking, as they wheeled her away. In the days that followed, Jamie felt a deep, aching emptiness. The house next door, once filled with warmth and laughter, now felt unbearably quiet. He struggled with the loss, finding it hard to focus on anything else. A week after her passing, Jamie's mom received a call from a lawyer handling Mrs. Gables's estate. She looked at Jamie with wide eyes. "The lawyer wants to meet with you," she said. "Me?" Jamie asked, confused. The next day, they sat in a small office where the lawyer, a kind man with glasses perched on the edge of his nose, explained that Mrs. Gables had included Jamie in her will. "She thought very highly of you," the lawyer said, sliding a stack of papers across the desk. "She left you something very special." Jamie blinked, trying to process the words. "What do you mean?" The lawyer smiled gently. "She left you her house and a portion of her savings. It's not a small amount, Jamie. Mrs. Gables was quite wealthy." Jamie's heart raced. "But why?" "I didn't do anything. She saw you as family," the lawyer said simply. "She wanted to make sure you were taken care of." Jamie stared at the papers, the weight of her kindness settling over him like a warm blanket. He had no idea Mrs. Gables had lived so modestly despite her wealth. She had never mentioned money, never hinted at the life she might have led before Maple Grove. The thought of her generosity made Jamie's chest ache, but it also filled him with a quiet determination. He would honor her memory, not by focusing on the money, but by remembering the lessons she had taught him: the value of connection, kindness, and looking out for one another. That night, as he stood in the quiet house next door, Jamie ran his fingers over the quilt she had made. It was finished, bright and warm, and it felt like a piece of her was still with him. "I won't let you down," he whispered. Jamie sat in stunned silence as the lawyer finished explaining the details of Mrs. Gables's will. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He learned that Mrs. Gables had left him not only her house but also a sum of $1.2 million. It was an amount so staggering that it didn't feel real. For someone who had grown up patching holes in his sneakers and counting coins for bus fare, the number might as well have been plucked from a dream. She was a millionaire," Jamie finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The lawyer nodded. "She lived a very modest life, but she had investments, savings, and some inherited wealth. She didn't flaunt it because she believed money was a tool, not a measure of a person's worth." Jamie shook his head in disbelief. In all the time he had spent with Mrs. Gables, she had never once mentioned her financial situation. Her house was old and a little run down, her clothes simple, and her habits unassuming. She had been content with what she had, finding joy in small things: gardening, sewing, and conversations over tea. I never knew, Jamie said, his voice tinged with guilt. I just thought she was like us, getting by one day at a time. The lawyer gave him a reassuring smile. She valued your friendship because it wasn't about what she had or didn't have. She saw something in you, Jamie. She knew you cared about her for who she was, not for what she could give you. The thought brought tears to Jamie's eyes. He had always cared about Mrs. Gables, but now he realized just how deeply she had cared about him in return. That afternoon, Jamie and his mom returned to Mrs. Gables's house. The air inside felt different now, still and heavy with the weight of her absence. Jamie wandered through the familiar rooms, noticing small details he had overlooked before. On the fireplace mantel was a framed photo of her and her late husband, Arthur, standing in front of what looked like a vineyard. Next to it was the quilt she had made, folded neatly on the armchair where she used to sit. Jamie ran his fingers over the fabric, tracing the colorful pattern she had sewn so carefully. It wasn't just a quilt, it was a testament to the love and care she had poured into their friendship. Later that evening, Jamie and his mom sat together in their kitchen, the papers from the lawyer spread out on the table. This could change everything for us, his mom said, her voice a mix of awe and caution. But we need to think carefully about what to do next. Jamie nodded. His mind raced with possibilities: paying off their debts, fixing up their house, maybe even helping his mom take a break from her grueling work schedule. But more than anything, he wanted to honor Mrs. Gables's memory. She hadn't left him this money to squander, she had done it because she believed in him. The next day, Jamie started sorting through Mrs. Gables's belongings, determined to learn more about the woman who had changed his life. As he opened drawers and sifted through boxes, he found glimpses of her story letters she had written to Arthur during their travels, photographs of the two of them at beaches, museums and cityscapes around the world, and even a collection of journals filled with neat, looping handwriting. One entry caught his attention. Arthur always said the measure of a good life isn't what you keep but what you give. I think he would have liked Jamie. That boy has a heart bigger than he realizes. Maybe I can help him see that someday. Jamie closed the journal, his chest tightening. He hadn't just been a companion to Mrs. Gables, he had been a source of hope for her in her later years. Over the next few weeks, Jamie worked tirelessly to honor her legacy. He started by using some of the money to fix up her house, repainting the walls and restoring the garden to the vibrant beauty she had described so often. The bird bath was cleaned and filled with fresh water, and he planted new flowers in her favorite colors: bright reds, yellows, and purples. As he worked, neighbors began to stop by, curious about what he was doing. Many of them had fond memories of Mrs. Gables, but they admitted they hadn't known her well. Jamie realized that her kindness had often gone unnoticed, hidden behind her quiet nature. Determined to share her story, Jamie organized a small gathering in her honor. He invited everyone in the neighborhood, sharing tea and cookies in the garden she had loved so much. As he told stories about their time together, he saw people's faces light up with recognition and regret. I wish I had gotten to know her better, one neighbor said, looking down at her cup of tea. She was a remarkable woman, Jamie replied. And she taught me that it's never too late to connect with someone. The gathering became a turning point for Jamie. It wasn't just about honoring Mrs. Gables's memory, it was about carrying her values forward. He decided to use the money she had left him to create something meaningful. He spoke with his mom about his idea, and together they decided to start a community program in Mrs. Gables's name. They called it the Gables Project, a small initiative to help struggling families in their neighborhood with groceries, school supplies, and access to community events. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was one they felt Mrs. Gables would have appreciated. Through it all, Jamie kept the quilt she had made draped over his bed as a reminder of her love and the lessons she had taught him. The money, though life-changing, wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the way Mrs. Gables had believed in him, trusted him, and shown him the value of kindness and connection. Over the following months, the Gables Project began to grow. Jamie and his mom poured their hearts into it, using part of the inheritance to establish a small fund that neighbors could contribute to and draw from when times were tough. They partnered with local businesses to host free community dinners, school supply drives, and even workshops for job training. Jamie couldn't help but smile whenever someone mentioned how much the project had already helped them. The house next door, once quiet and overgrown, had become a hub of activity. Jamie made sure Mrs. Gables' garden was always blooming, and he kept the birdbath full for the sparrows she had loved to watch. He had decided to keep the house, using it as the headquarters for the project. The living room became a cozy meeting space, the kitchen was stocked for community potlucks, and the sunroom with its sewing machine and vibrant plants served as a small library and reading nook. Jamie often thought of Mrs. Gables as he sat on her old armchair, working on plans for the project. He hoped she would be proud of what he was doing with her legacy. One day, as he was tidying up the sunroom, Jamie noticed a small wooden box tucked behind a row of potted plants. He hadn't seen it before, and wondered if it had been left there intentionally. Carefully, he opened it and found a bundle of old photographs and a handwritten letter addressed to him. The letter was short, but it carried the weight of Mrs. Gables' affection. Dear Jamie, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to pester you about drinking your tea too fast or leaving crumbs on the table. I hope this letter finds you well and happy. More than anything, I hope you found your path. When I first met you, I didn't expect much, just a boy retrieving his basketball from my yard. But as time went on, you reminded me of all the good in the world, of the kindness I thought was fading. You gave me purpose in my final years, Jamie. For that, I am endlessly grateful. This box holds memories of the happiest times in my life. I leave it to you not as a burden, but as a reminder to cherish the moments that matter. Money comes and goes, but love, kindness, and connection are what truly endure. Take care of yourself, and take care of others. With love, Eleanor Gables. Jamie sat quietly for a long time, the letter resting in his lap. He looked through the photographs, snapshots of Mrs. Gables and her husband traveling, laughing, and building their life together. There were even a few photos of her garden in its prime, brimming with color and vitality. The letter reinforced everything Jamie had come to understand about her. She had been a woman of quiet wisdom, someone who valued connection over wealth and action over words. Years passed, and Jamie's life continued to change in ways he couldn't have imagined. He graduated high school, then college, studying nonprofit management so he could expand the Gables project. With careful planning and support from the community, the project grew beyond their small neighborhood, helping families in surrounding areas. Through it all, Jamie remained grounded in the lessons Mrs. Gables had taught him. He never let the money define him, using it as a tool to make a difference rather than a measure of his worth. On the 10-year anniversary of Mrs. Gables' passing, Jamie organized a garden dedication in her honor. Neighbors, friends, and even people from other towns came to celebrate her memory. They shared stories of how the Gables project had impacted their lives, but Jamie's favorite moments were when they talked about Mrs. Gables herself, the quiet, kind woman who had planted the seeds of so much good. As the sun set over the blooming garden, Jamie stood by the birdbath, now surrounded by vibrant flowers. He held the quilt she had made, its colors still as bright as the day she finished it. He felt her presence in the rustling leaves and the cheerful chirping of birds. "Thank you, Mrs. Gables," he whispered, a lump in his throat. "For everything." That evening, Jamie returned to the house next door, the home she had left to him. The place where their friendship had changed his life. Sitting in her old armchair, he looked at the photographs she had left him, the quilt draped over his shoulders. He didn't feel like a millionaire because of the money. He felt rich because of the love and lessons she had shared with him. And as he drifted to sleep, he knew he would carry her kindness forward for the rest of his life.